So I'm Jason Forster. I'll be your host today. Really introduce Robert Graybill. He joined FMS in 2000 and has over 30 years of experience in the grocery retail industry. Currently, Robert is president and CEO, leads the FMS team in their meetings. They're meeting their goals and helping retailers to succeed through benchmarking, best practices, and decision support. So at this point, I'll turn it over to you.
Can you guys hear me in the back? Okay, perfect. So today we're going to talk a little bit about a survey that we do with the National Grocers Association, which is a compilation of independents across the United States. We also do a separate one for some Canadian retailers. Basically looks at different financial benchmarks. With the 25 minutes, though, that we have here today, we're going to focus on profit leaders and a little bit of the economic indicators going on in the industry. So talk very briefly about the consumer, marketplace, inflation, labor and productivity, and then really look at what the profit leaders, what separates them, and why some of the things that we've identified in previous surveys are even more important today in today's marketplace. So when we look at the consumers, obviously there's a large percentage of American households that are stressed today as far as their ability that they feel they can pay bills. There was a good article this morning in the Wall Street Journal on credit card debt and credit cards being used to buy groceries because people can't make ends meet week to week. So from a consumer perspective, we all know and we all see on the news what's out there. What it's translating to from our last couple studies is obviously eating out less. It's harder to track right now because last year restaurants were reopening in some jurisdictions. So you had dollars transitioning back to grocery stores and back to restaurant, or going to grocery stores, but dollars still going back to restaurants as they open. So the numbers are a little fuzzy for last year because you really saw the re-engagement with people eating out. You still do have some people that aren't. Unfortunately, my parents are one that just started really going out publicly. As I'm out traveling around, I'd meet them in the front yard because they were one of those elderly couples that were scared to get COVID and have something happen. So I stood in front of the house. We had picnics outside. But there are still people out there like that, unfortunately. But that will eventually get back into the restaurant dollars. So switching to private label, looking for cheaper items, buying what's on sale. You guys all know that. AWG had an article this morning in the Shelby report on AWG brand sales, and we look at those sales dollars in private label and they're going through the roof. The one thing that I don't see as much out there across the independents that we see in the chains are the compare and save baskets. We see some of the shelf tags, shelf talkers out there. But there's a company, Southeast Grocer, which owns Winn-Dixie and BI-LO, and they do a real shopping cart. So I used to be director of pricing for A&P, and when we did compare and save carts, you always loaded up your sale merchandise, made yourself look really better than day-to-day pricing. They're taking a daily approach of saying, hey, we're going to put together basically a real shopping cart. K-cups, whatever else in there, lunch meat or Lunchables that are the private label they carry, et cetera. So that when you walk out of the store as a consumer, you see that cart and you see that 25% or 28% savings on what they're showing against their national brands. What that does is just reminds the customer that, hey, maybe next time when I come in, my grocery bill seemed a little high. I need to take advantage of this. But one of the things I will say about those carts is make them real. People know when they see water chestnuts in there and say, oh, you saved $1 on private label. Like, who the hell cares? Like, how often do you eat them? Once every 3 months. So put stuff in there that consumers can catch their eye in the cart as they walk by. When we look at prepared dishes, there's a bunch of opportunities out there to show basically meals for families of 4 and what it costs compared to the average restaurant. And have somebody put together good graphics, good recipes that really will carry through with everybody. So in the end, we're just trying to address where consumers are. Very quickly, e-commerce sort of spiked during COVID. These are 2021 numbers, but basically 53% versus 47%. So people started re-engaging in the grocery store in person. And when we look back from 2017, I like to share this slide because going into COVID effectively, had we not had the online home delivery, when we look back at 2017 with almost 2/3 not, basically the independent industry would have been in a lot worse shape going into COVID to serve their communities. So let's get to today. We look at food inflation for February. It did drop down a little bit, but from 11.3 to 10.2. And when we start to look at different numbers on here, you can see the growth. We look at the productivity, labor issues, also global demands. And then if you think about more turns of the printing press for the federal government, we're talking about new programs to help people. Well, the way to help people is stop inflation. If you read, Argentina's up to 100% inflation. So effectively, their money's worth half. If we continue down this path, we're going to continue with the same issue. So shifting gears into real numbers that matter to you guys, if we look across retailers in the last couple of years and we adjust for inflation, we go back to the peak of the pandemic year at 13.5, take the 8.2 out, you're at about 5.3% still ahead. But then when you look at the 10%, 11% inflation this year, we're really starting to revert back to pre-pandemic sales, okay? What that means, though, deeper is we have inflationary, which means we're selling less items. From a productivity perspective, though, effectively, we've got to start to look, and we're going to talk a little bit about productivity, cashier productivity, stocking, putting shelf tags up, keeping up with pricing, et cetera. But we need to look at as many different ways to increase productivity, but also how we look at labor, and we'll talk about that in a second. So what's the difference with the profit leaders besides higher profits? They're called profit leaders for that reason. We look across the board, low debt. So this was a plus always because it allowed people to have as much free cash flow to invest in their store and fight off competition. The issue today, though, is for people that kept heavy burden balance sheets that weren't part of this profit leader group, now we have interest rates going up. And that's going to suck more cash out of the business. And we're at a time where we're seeing wages go up, prices going up, consumers cutting back. We also have trouble finding labor. We're seeing minimum wage increases. And on top of that, your interest rate payments are going to be going up. So in the end, if you think back for the last 15 years that we've been tracking the profit leaders, talking about get the debt off your balance sheet, get the debt off your balance sheet, we're now at a point in time that truly matters and it's going to start to impact people. Higher CapEx. We've had record profits in the industry the last 2 years. We probably will have the third highest this year still for the previous year. By putting money back into the stores with that money, whether it's PPP money, whether it's ERC money, whether it's profits from that time period, whatever it is getting the debt off the balance sheet and getting the investments back in the store. The issue for some retailers, and I can think of some because we deal with a lot, money comes out of the store, money comes out of the store, money comes out of the store, competitor opens, crap, I got to invest back in my store. Let me go to the bank and borrow, and now interest rates are climbing, and now you're crippled by interest on your P&L. Perishable sales and overall gross margins, we'll talk about that afterwards, and then lower shrink. We've got high staff turnover, difficulty in the labor market. Shrink, when we look at the profit leaders, all have shrink programs and shrink training programs. So they use technology and they use the people training. If we look and say to ourselves, we've got all the staff turnover, what do you expect? Shrink went up this past year, and it'll probably go up this year as well. Primarily driven by the fact that such a small percentage of retailers have formal programs that they really stick to. So that's going to be important if we want to start to move forward on our shrink numbers. So if we go down, and I'm going to hop off the stage here, just to break a leg. We look at last year at 5.02, 3.62% in net profits before taxes. So this includes interest, this includes depreciation, et cetera. For the non-accountants of the world, EBITDA is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So think about, we saw profits drop roughly about 1.4, and we saw EBITDA drop, roughly a little bit less than that, 1%, and think about what's happening to interest rates today. So if we think about the net profit, interest is starting to have an impact. And when we look at EBITDA, we think of EBITDA as sort of a measurement. Banks use it for multiples on loans. They use it for multiples on sales and purchases. So when we start to look at interest, this is a great number from a cash, from a bank perspective, from a sale perspective. But when we start looking at the impact on our cash flow statement, it's growing significantly. So here's the kind of span for last year. We look at the profit leaders, which are the top 25%, had a 10.1% profit. We look at the median at 3.8, which is the middle mark for non-math people. But we've got a pretty wide spread here. And when we look at the survey right before the pandemic, this bottom 25th percentile was minus 0.5%. So we spent year one, jumped up. We spent year two, kind of fell a little bit. This next survey coming out is you're gonna start to see that bottom 25th percentile shift back down into lower profits closer to zero. So it's important as we look at the profit leaders, if you're in this category here this last year and you were in the minus 0.5 in previous years, is really to start looking at the differences between those who are in the top quartile that weren't that high pre-pandemic, but they were still high, and really the difference between your organization. Everybody's got unique circumstances, but really understanding how you can effectuate and impact your shrink, how you can impact your free cash flow so that you can make investments into ads, make investments into your stores, and not trap cash. So we look at the Fed, the debt, and the CapEx. Basically on the 17th, St. Patrick's Day, I think the only people that got the luck of the Irish and the gold are the bankers. And they are putting more and more in their pocket every day and then still going under. But we saw a 1/4 point increase. We saw the European Central Bank go up 0.5%. And then obviously we all know about Silicon Valley Bank, Republic Bank, and the scariest one is Credit Suisse because they are huge. And we're fortunate that somebody's going to buy them. But if we look, we said the profit leaders carry a low debt burden. They spend more on CapEx every year to reinvest. So they're taking less out of their company. This is not going to stop here. When we're looking at inflation rates that have dropped, but food inflation continuing at 10%, coming down, the Fed really has no choice but to continue this path because we put so much money out on the street that we're going to probably look at another 2 quarter meetings. We're going to see 2 more increases, is what everybody's saying. That could be anywhere between 1/4 and 1/2 point. So think about that when you think about your debt and your variable interest rates. So this is just a real simple, this is very basic, just because you can't get me explaining all the ins and outs. But effectively, if we take a store that has $200,000 in weekly annual sales, we've got $10 million in sales. We use as a benchmark, you'll see the percentages for profit on each one of these, but the base has 2% net profit before taxes. We take the additional interest payments, since rates have gone up, $75,000. Our new net profit goes from 2% net profit before taxes to 1.28. If you were at 1%, you're down to 0.28. And now if you're down here in the 0.5% category, you're down to a negative net profit before taxes, all because of interest payments. So that's going to be the power of debt. And that's one of the things profit leaders have a huge advantage in people that don't have debt on their balance sheet. So if you have those funds, if you got PPP funds, you got extra profits, extra cash, you really want to look at what your debt's costing you today. And this is going to equate in other things because that cost of capital, if you think about forward buying, there used to be things in the past, you buy X number of weeks supply based on a 1% deal, 2%, 3%, et cetera. The cost of capital's changed. So we also need to look at how we're tying our cash up because if you're paying 7 or 8% on your debt, what makes more sense, to build a back room or does it make more sense to pay down your debt? And that's something you have to do on paper to take a look. When we look at productivity, we look at true growth or retraction. As I had said, we've got a cashier out there scanning the same sales dollars, but she's scanning less items. A night crew, sales are going up because of inflation, so as a percentage of sales, labor should be going down. Labor's going up at a slower rate right now in most markets than the cost of goods. So finding ways to improve productivity. We basically have a little company called GOT. You do your shelf tags in order, so they print out an order, makes it quicker to tag the store. Those things sound small and kind of minuscule, but the reality is if you can save 15, 20 minutes off of each of your employees, all of a sudden you've got hours, and then those hours every day, every week, et cetera. So looking for simple things that cost your employees time. Paperless payroll, instead of having them come up to the front office, talk to the bookkeeper, get their paycheck, walk back, talk to the produce guy. I used to be a meat cutter. I did it all the time. Thursday I went and got my check. I probably went up 3 times, like, are the checks in, because I had no money. I get my check, I cash it up front. I was 20 years old, so walk back through produce, talk to the floral girl, talk to the produce manager, then get back to the meat department 25 minutes later for a paycheck. That's what you want to prevent. Put the cash in their bank. There's no more going and handing out checks, cash and checks, et cetera. So look at all your departments because meat inflation is different than dairy, is different than produce, et cetera. So when you have things like bonus programs that are based off those sales, you need to adjust for inflation. I mean, it's pretty simple to do with the data that's out there. So just, again, very basic math, because we want to keep this simple for the presentation. But you've got $100,000 in sales. This was from January's inflation number. If you just took a perfect world, it would go to 111,000. Labor wages were up over that time period by 5%. And if you look, you were running a 12% labor rate here. All things the same because of inflation, you should be running 11.32. So look at what your wages are going up against your sales. I know when you guys budget, you look at hours, productivity, number of hours on the front end, number of hours in the deli department, but keep an eye on those percentages in dollars because they'll help kind of bring everything back in balance, just as a double check. I mean, you guys all know what you're doing. You've been doing this for a while. So, but just let the numbers tell you that what you're kind of planning is making sense and coming out. So when we look at all of our businesses, you know, including from the wholesale side, AWG, to the retail stores, to the consumer, we're really, to coin a phrase that's overused, everybody has to win in the equation. So we have to find ways to better serve our consumers, offer them values while they're struggling. We have to find ways to improve our profits. And then on top of that, obviously, you want AWG to be healthy and grow because you're part of a co-op. So everybody's got to kind of win in these circles. And when we look at retail inflation with the consumer, retail inflation rarely, back here in 2012, outpaced eating at restaurants and really shot up more recently here. The end game is to kind of look and see where our consumers are standing. So 43% of Americans, you looked at that other thing, hey, I'm living check to check 30%, I'm living here 20%. These are people, and this is a little bit newer number than the previous sheet, that are basically saying they're financially stressed right now. So 4 in 10 of your customers, depending on the neighborhood you're in, basically walks in your store and they're feeling financial burden paying their bills. So that's a lot of people trying to figure out how to make ends meet, and they're looking for value. Gas prices, you know, from years ago, more than doubled. They're starting to come back down. Rents are way up. Income's up, but it increased less than inflation. Credit card debt is up huge. Utilities are going up. GDP is up last quarter, but remember we had the 2 negative quarters, so you know, we'll find out 6 months later from the economists that we were in a recession, but they tend to be a little behind in their answers. So looking at what you can do to healthen up your store and the retailer, keeping up with price checks and increases. We've seen, you know, pasta, for example, and just pick on something, the private label pasta go up 26% in 1 week. There was a TPR floating out there that was like an 8 or 10% one in the future. It was better to buy in before the price increase than it was to buy on the deal. Those are the kinds of things that you need to be looking out for. Those are the things that can put extra dollars in your pocket, either to reinvest through running those items on sale, or to turn around, reinvest in paying down debt that you're paying 8% on. You have to start thinking about, there's a lot of pieces going on with the food inflation that people aren't keeping up with. Unfortunately, we've got a story of a retailer that had somebody work for them that was not keeping up with prices and nobody was checking. And they were about 6 months behind. And think of that on 10% inflation in a year, say 5 for half a year. It's a lot of money. So be creative with, bonus programs we talked about, but really start looking at the impact of inflation and wages on your bonus programs if you have certain rates. A good focus on shrink is also important because ultimately it's one of the big factors with the profit leaders. Being creative with your promotions. People are strapped for cash. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I was younger and strapped for cash, you're miserable a lot because you're trying to figure out how to pay for things. Bring some excitement into the store. You know, we've had all these customers kind of forced to go to grocery stores for 2 years and not eat out because things were closed. Now they're back. Create some excitement and reason to be in your store. Present the savings on private label. We talked about baskets at the front. And then make private label. You guys have a really good private label program. Make it about the value and about the goodness, not about the 50 cents or $1. You need to show the dollar savings, but you also, I don't know what kind of programs are out there to do taste tests in the store against certain products and really encourage the movement of that so that you can compare and save in your basket, on your shelf tags, et cetera, but drive the customer to say, hey, this spaghetti sauce tastes just like Prego, or this thing tastes just like this national brand, or the Dawn dish liquid's the same as the private label. There's going to be ones, obviously, that are different. I can name a few that I buy that you buy once and you're like, ooh. But for the most part, 95% of private label brands really are, in my opinion, not very distinguishable between the national brand. So the last one is reinvest. So if you're not debt laden, you've got this cash, you're ready to kind of roll, you're looking at it going, boy, I sure would like a new boat. Put it off, get some new freezers. You can grab a paddle and sit in your coffin freezer and pretend you're out on your boat. I don't know. So bring yourself some joy. So margins shrink in your bottom line. And let me just check my time here. Sorry. Make sure we're on track here. So when we look at the profit leaders, I put the differences in the distribution rate. So, we've talked years competing against the big box produce, perishables, et cetera. But here's the difference between the profit leaders and the pack. 2% higher distribution rate in total produce, made up of 1.7 and 0.3% produce and floral. Total meat, 3.6%. So if we look down the board here, deli and hot foods, 2.1% higher than the rest of the people outside of the profit leaders. You go straight down the line. Think about the margins that come out of those two departments and what that does to your bottom line and why they're up in the profit leader category. On top of that, think about the amount of shrink that hits deli and hot foods, and profit leaders still have lower shrink than the balance of the category. We look at the gross margins. Produce is running 5.3% higher, 3.7% floral, meat 6.1, deli hot foods 2.5, bakery 7.9. That's a huge one to me because that has so much waste. So they've got something figured out there as far as their programs. And then seafood, 3.8. The profit leaders, I didn't put grocery, et cetera, up because obviously these guys are higher and their perishables lower on their distribution rates and non-perishables, but in margins, they were higher in all categories except for tobacco. So they're putting a push across their store, they're controlling shrink, they're controlling their pricing, their margins, and they're really doing a good job based on their profits, the bottom line, and effectively their shrink numbers. So I just wanted to, gaining control of shrink, pricing, buying losses. We looked across some of the GOT customers, an average year-to-date savings with the shrink tracking and markdown programs of $12,571 over 12 months, $2,500 per month in order savings. In addition to last day to save, about $30K annually for that store size. So you look at the 80 grand and think back to our interest expense example of $75,000. You got a way to pay for it through reducing shrink, reducing markdowns, and buying in properly. I don't care if it's GOT, if you use a spreadsheet, whatever. The point is look at this stuff. This is the way I can see and track it. So profit leaders had lower shrink, and most have the shrink planning and training. So I talked about trapped cash and capital. And when we look at store inventories, we're doing a lot better job of using our cash and not trapping it in inventory. The more turns, you guys are making 1 or 2 cents non-pandemic times on the dollar on average. So when we look at that, if we can turn 20 times versus 18 times, that's 2 cents on every dollar. 2 more turns is 4 more cents on your capital. So think about that as you have departments like general merchandise or HBC, and you walk along and there's a pile of dust on something, which hopefully you're dusting your shelves, but if you're not, you'll find dust on those items that aren't moving. That's trapped cash sitting there. I don't know AWG's program for returns or fees for returns, but you want to look at your stocking levels for things that aren't moving, especially high dollar things. It's cash that should go to debt. It's cash that should go to investment. And that is my warning there. And we'll go ahead and click on here. So the last slide here, the next survey questionnaire is coming out this Friday. So please participate. You can go to our website. We'll also be doing mailers out. Everything's confidential. We don't share anything with anybody. But we gather from thousands of retailers around the country, and it helps us get more detailed on this. You can get a copy of the survey book. Stan McClintock, who's in the back, will be at our booth, can either get you an electronic link, or if he has some paper books left over, can give you a copy of the book, and keep an eye out for the survey. And in closing, just like to say, there's supplemental information posted on the AWG site that has some labor numbers from a salary survey, and I put those out there just for your guys' perusal at a later time. So thank you guys very much. I appreciate it.